It is 1970. The United States is a nation divided. On one side, the counterculture rages. Vietnam protests flood college campuses, Woodstock echoes in the rearview mirror, and the Beatles are days away from breaking up. On the other side, Detroit is engaged in a very different kind of war, a war of horsepower. Gasoline costs just 36 cents a gallon. The average American family has a driveway big enough for 2 cars, and the youth, hungry for speed and rebellion, want something bigger, louder and meaner than their fathers ever drove. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, they're locked in a gladiator fight to see who can build the fastest machine for America's streets. And from this chaos emerges a monster, a car that looks like steel carved into muscle, a machine with so much torque it could twist its own frame, a car whispered about in high school parking lots, feared by insurance companies and chased by law enforcement, the 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS 454. But the Chevelle that most people think they know, the one on posters, on drag strips, and in Hollywood films, hides secrets. Behind its bulging fenders and Cowl induction hood lies a story far stranger than brochures ever told. Because this car wasn't just about horsepower. It was about rebellion, about deception, and about how far Detroit was willing to go to outsmart the system. So tonight, we begin our countdown of 20 things you never knew about the 1970 Chevelle SS 454. Number 20 corporate rules said it couldn't exist. In the late 1960s, General Motors had imposed a strict corporate policy. No mid-sized car was allowed to carry an engine larger than 400 cubic inches. That was supposed to keep cars like the Chevelle in check. Family cars, commuter cars, nothing too outrageous. The big power was meant for full-sized models only, but Chevrolet's engineers had a different idea. They wanted a weapon. They wanted something that would destroy Ford Mustangs, humiliate Dodge Challengers, and leave Plymouth Barracudas choking on dust. So, they found a loophole. In 1970, GM quietly relaxed the rule, opening the door for engines bigger than 400 cubic inches in mid-sized cars, and Chevy went for the jugular. They stuffed the monstrous 454 cubic inch V8 into the Chevelle. On paper, the top-spec LS6 version made 450 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque. Those numbers already made it the most powerful muscle car of its time. But here's the twist. Whispered in garages and scrawled in drag racing magazines were rumors that GM had lied. Dyno sheets from private tuners showed numbers closer to 500 horsepower, sometimes even higher. Some said Chevrolet deliberately downplayed the LS6's power to keep regulators and insurers off their backs. The Chevelle SS 454 wasn't just breaking the rules, it was hiding how badly it shattered them. The consequence? A car that looked legal on paper but on the street was nothing short of mechanical treason. Number 19, the Chevelle was never supposed to wear a badge of law enforcement. And yet, in a bizarre twist of history, it almost did. Buried in GM archives and whispered among retired officers is the story of police departments that briefly evaluated the Chevelle SS 454. In the late 60s, American highways were getting longer, straighter, and faster. Outlaws in big block cars were outrunning standard cruisers with ease. Some departments went hunting for a solution. The Chevelle SS 454 was tested as a pursuit car. On paper, it was perfect. Raw speed, aggressive presence, and enough torque to pin suspects to the ground. But there was a problem. Officers quickly realized it was too much car. It guzzled fuel like a fire hose. It required constant maintenance. And most dangerously, it was faster than the men driving it. One evaluation allegedly ended in disaster when a rookie officer lost control of a 454-powered Chevelle during a training chase. The car was written off. The program was abandoned. No official police Chevelles ever made it to production. But to this day, collectors whisper about lost cop Chevelles, a handful of test cars that slipped out into the public. Were they crushed? Were they sold quietly at auction? Nobody knows. but the thought of a police-issued SS454 prowling the streets remains one of muscle car history's strangest what-ifs. Number 18 power can be a gift, but in the Chevelle SS454, it was also a curse. Everyone remembers the car's brutal straight-line speed, but few talk about its hidden weak point, the rear axle. The SS came standard with a 12-bolt differential, stronger than the 10-bolt units found in lesser Chevelle. On paper, it was built to withstand punishment. In reality, the torque of the LS6 was so brutal that axles sometimes shattered under hard launches. At drag strips, racers called it the grenade effect. One wrong clutch drop, and you'd hear a bang followed by the sickening sound of gears grinding themselves to dust. Chevrolet knew. Quietly, dealers replaced broken units under warranty, sometimes without ever filing paperwork. But owners caught in the act of street racing often weren't so lucky. Word spread fast. If you drove an SS454, you didn't just risk losing to the competition, you risked destroying your own car in the process. The legacy of those failures lingers today. Collectors restoring Chevelles often find mismatched axles, or components that don't line up with factory records. It's the smoking gun of a past life, a reminder that these cars weren't pampered showpieces in 1970. They were war machines, and sometimes the war was against themselves. Number 17, everyone remembers the stripes. When you picture a 1970 Chevelle SS454, you see it, that long, muscular hood, bulging with the power of the Cowl induction scoop, and framed by bold racing stripes running from nose to tail. Those stripes became an icon, as recognizable as the car's roar. But here's what most people don't know. Those stripes were not the precision-painted perfection we imagine today. They were done by hand. In Chevrolet's factories, stripes were applied at the end of the line, often late at night when tired workers were rushing to meet quotas. Templates existed, yes, but human hands laid the tape and sprayed the paint. And human hands make mistakes. Stripes came out crooked. They varied in width. Some didn't even line up between the hood and the trunk. Customers complained. But over time, this imperfection became a mark of authenticity. Real Chevelle had flaws. The perfectly aligned stripes we see on restored cars today, those are the fakes. Original stripes told the truth. They were slightly off-center, sometimes uneven, a reminder that these machines were built in sweat and haste, not by robots. The irony is delicious. What modern collectors obsess over correcting was, back in 1970, a factory defect. And if you see a Chevelle with flawless stripes, you might just be staring at a restoration, not a survivor. Number 16, by the early 70s, the Chevelle SS454 had carved itself into pop culture. It wasn't just a car, it was an attitude. On drag strips, it was feared. On suburban streets, it was envied. And in movies, it became a star. Decades later, Richard Linklater's Dazed and Confused cast a Chevelle as the burnout king's weapon of choice, a cinematic symbol of raw teenage rebellion. But back in the day, the Chevelle had another name, a darker one. They called it the Widowmaker. With up to 500 pound-feet of torque, the SS454 could shred its rear tires into smoke. But brakes? Many models still had drums on all four corners. Combine that with a heavy frame and an inexperienced teenage driver, and you had a recipe for disaster. Insurance companies noticed. By 1971, owning a Chevelle SS454 was financial suicide for young drivers. Premiums tripled. Some companies flat out refused coverage. Parents begged their kids not to buy them. Newspapers warned of killer muscle cars. But the warnings only added to the legend. Like a forbidden fruit, the Chevelle SS454 became more desirable the more dangerous it was said to be. And in a way, the nickname Widowmaker stuck, not because of mechanical flaws, but because of the fear it planted in society. It was a car So powerful, it terrified not just those who drove it, but everyone who tried to control it. Number 15, most people think they know everything about the Chevelle from glossy brochures and car magazine tests. But the real secrets weren't printed. They were hidden. Every Chevelle that rolled off the line carried a piece of paper known as the build sheet. It listed every option, every code, every specification. Most of the time, these sheets were discarded. But sometimes, they were left tucked under seats, inside door panels, or behind dashboards. Forgotten by the factory, rediscovered decades later by restorers. And this is where things get strange. Some build sheets revealed bizarre anomalies. Cars ordered with mismatched colors, interiors that didn't match exteriors, taxi-grade vinyl upholstery inside 454 monsters, and the most mysterious of all, fleet codes. Collectors whisper about Chevelles ordered through back-channel fleet programs, cars with government or corporate ties. Were they test mules for high-speed pursuit vehicles, secret evaluation cars? No one knows for sure. But each time a build sheet surfaces with unexplained codes, it fuels conspiracy theories that the SS 454 wasn't just a showroom car. It was part of experiments we were never meant to know about. Finding a build sheet is like uncovering buried treasure. But sometimes that treasure comes with questions Chevy never intended to answer. Number 14, the Cowl induction hood. At first glance, it looks like pure muscle car theater. A swollen scoop, a gaping mouth at the base of the windshield, an aesthetic warning that something monstrous lurks beneath. But it wasn't just for show. It had a secret. The flap at the back of the hood wasn't always open. It was vacuum operated. When the driver pushed the throttle deep enough, the engine's vacuum pressure triggered the flap, snapping it open to gulp down high-pressure air rushing against the windshield. This wasn't random. It was physics. At speed, air builds up at the cowl, denser and cooler than the hot underhood air. Feeding that into the carburetor meant more oxygen, more combustion, and more horsepower. Owners swore it added an extra 10-15 horsepower, like a secret power-up button. And on the drag strip, you could hear it, a sudden gasp, followed by a deeper roar, as if the car itself was inhaling before a knockout punch. But here's the twist. The flap wasn't perfect. In heavy rain, if the flap stuck open, water poured straight into the air cleaner. Engines sputtered, plugs fouled, and frustrated owners cursed the very feature that had been sold as revolutionary. What Chevrolet called induction by science sometimes felt like leakage by design. It didn't matter. To fans, the Cowl induction hood became iconic. Even with its flaws, it turned the Chevelle SS 454 into a car that didn't just sound alive, it breathed. Number 13, in the world of muscle cars, not every legend comes from a brochure. Some are born in whispers. By 1970, the Chevelle SS 454 LS6 was the undisputed king of horsepower. But drag racers noticed something strange. Some cars, right off the showroom floor, seemed unbeatable. Others, supposedly identical, lagged behind. Theories spread like wildfire. One explanation? The backdoor cars. Dealers with the right connections allegedly received hand-picked LS6 engines from Chevrolet. These weren't ordinary blocks. They were blueprint balanced, assembled with tighter tolerances, maybe even with experimental carburetors. On paper, all LS6s were equal. On the street, some were monsters. Racers had their own slang for it: the Monday morning dogs and the Friday afternoon rockets. If your engine was built on a Monday, after a long weekend, you might have a sluggish car. But if your Chevelle's block came from a Friday build, touched by engineers eager to prove a point, you might have a silent ringer. Chevy never admitted this practice. But to this day, collectors debate whether certain LS6 Chevelles were more than just lucky. Were they factory freaks? Or carefully placed weapons slipped into the hands of racers to keep Chevrolet's reputation alive? The truth is still buried, but the myth remains, not all Chevelle were created equal. Some were chosen. Number 12, to understand the Chevelle SS 454, you have to understand the era's politics. In 1970, Congress was sharpening its knives. The Clean Air Act loomed, emissions controls were on the horizon, and public safety groups accused Detroit of recklessly selling speed. Automakers knew the muscle car party wouldn't last forever. Behind closed doors, lobbyists begged for delays, while engineers raced against time to squeeze out one last gasp of unrestricted power. The Chevelle SS 454 LS6 became that gasp. It was the final muscle car built before catalytic converters, before low-compression engines, before federal strangulation. At 1125-1 compression, with forged internals and a Holley 800 CFM carb, the LS6 wasn't just powerful, it was politically defiant. 1 year later, the hammer dropped. Compression ratios plummeted, horsepower ratings collapsed, insurance companies tightened their chokehold, and the muscle car era began its slow death. The Chevelle SS 454 stands frozen in time, a one-year wonder, the last unconstrained titan. It wasn't just a car. It was a protest in steel, an outlaw's middle finger to the government's tightening leash. Number 11, every great car has a signature quirk, and for the Chevelle SS 454, one of its strangest was the hood-mounted tachometer. Most cars of the era kept their tach tucked away inside the dashboard cluster, a small dial competing with speedometers and fuel gauges. But Chevrolet offered something different. A tachometer perched right on the hood, just above the driver's line of sight. They called it the Cowl hood tach. At first glance, it looked like a gimmick, a little plastic pod with a needle, flicking under a glass dome. But on the street and at the drag strip, it became a racer's best friend. You didn't have to look down. You didn't have to take your eyes off the road. You just watched the needle climb toward red line as the asphalt blurred beneath you. It gave the driver a sense of being locked into combat. Every shift timed with precision, every race decided by a glance at that dome. But here's the twist. That tach was notoriously fragile. The wiring ran under the hood, exposed to brutal heat, constant vibration, and the elements. Many tachs failed within months. Some froze in place, others died completely. By the mid-70s, finding a functioning hood tach was rare. Today, collectors treat surviving originals like gold. A working hood tach isn't just a feature, it's proof your Chevelle lived through the fire and still breathes. In a way, that little pod wasn't just a gauge, it was a badge of battle. Number 10, if police were afraid of the Chevelle SS 454, insurance companies downright hated it. By 1970, insurers had begun tracking high-risk cars, and the Chevelle LS6, with its 454 cubic inch monster, went straight to the blacklist. Premiums doubled, sometimes tripled, just for owning one. For young drivers, the math was impossible. You could afford the car, but not the insurance. So what did some owners do? They cheated the system. Street rumors tell of shady swaps. VN tags pulled from base model Chevelles and riveted onto SS 454s. On paper, the car was a mild-mannered six-cylinder Malibu. In reality, it was a fire-breathing LS6, hidden in plain sight. This deception gave birth to legends of the Phantom SS. Some of these cars survived into the collector era, confusing experts. Was it a true SS 454 or a Malibu in disguise? Forensic inspectors now study stampings, welds, and factory codes like detectives solving crimes. The hunt for authenticity has become its own battlefield. But one thing is clear. Back in 1970, the Chevelle SS 454 was so feared that it created an underground economy of fake identities. It wasn't just a car, it was a fugitive. Number 9, most people assume the Chevelle SS 454 was as American as apple pie, born, bred, and built in Detroit. But hidden in the shadows of General Motors' empire was a second birthplace, Oshawa, Ontario, Canada. Yes, some SS454s were assembled north of the border, and while they looked nearly identical, Canadian Chevelles carried quirks that set them apart. Metric speedometers, unique trim codes, different rust-proofing processes to endure harsher winters. Even small details like seatbelt tags and window stickers carried Canadian identifiers. For decades, these cars were dismissed. American collectors sneered, calling them less authentic, as if a Canadian-built Chevelle was somehow a counterfeit. Prices stayed low, and owners struggled for recognition. But then, the tide turned. As records surfaced and production numbers were clarified, it became clear Canadian-built SS454s were rarer than many U.S. counterparts. Suddenly, the overlooked northern cousins became prized possessions. At auctions today, an Oshawa-built Chevelle can spark bidding wars, not for what made it different, but for the fact that it survived decades of being misunderstood. In the end, the Chevelle SS454 wasn't just American muscle, it was international muscle. Proof that speed, rebellion, and defiance didn't stop at the border. Number 8, the Chevelle SS454 didn't just leave tire marks on asphalt, it left marks in the courtroom. By the early 1970s, stories began circulating of accidents involving Chevelle where the brakes allegedly failed. Families sued, lawyers circled, and General Motors suddenly found itself dragged into legal battles it wanted no part of. On paper, the Chevelle's braking system was adequate. But in reality, many SS454s still used drum brakes all around. Combine that with nearly 2 tons of steel and a 450 horsepower big block, and you had a car that went from 0 to 100 faster than most drivers could comprehend, yet took an eternity to stop. One case in the Midwest told of a teenager who lost control after the brakes faded on a long downhill run. Another lawsuit claimed the drums warped under repeated stops, causing catastrophic accidents. GM quietly settled many of these cases. Officially, they admitted nothing, but whispers spread that Chevrolet knew the SS454's brakes were outmatched by its engine. To muscle car fans, it became part of the legend. The car that could outrun anything, but might not stop in time. Was it a defect? Or just the inevitable price of strapping dynamite to a family sedan? Either way, the Chevelle carried that dark reputation into history, loved for its speed, feared for its flaws. Number 7, every great car has myths. And for the Chevelle SS454, one of the strangest was the tale of the cursed variances. Collectors whisper about a small batch of Chevelles built in late 1969, each carrying specific variance sequences. At first, they were just numbers on a plate. But over time, stories piled up. One was wrecked days after leaving the dealership. Another's engine seized inexplicably on the highway. A third disappeared entirely, its trail ending in a scrapyard with no record of who brought it in. Coincidence? Maybe. But superstitious racers swore these cars were cursed. Owners traded them quickly, unable to shake the feeling that bad luck followed wherever the cars went. Some even claimed the VINs were flagged in Chevrolet's internal system, as if GM knew something but kept quiet. Of course, skeptics laugh. They say it's just the usual fate of high-performance cars pushed too hard by inexperienced drivers. But among diehards, the cursed Chevelles have taken on an almost supernatural aura. Finding one today is like discovering a haunted artifact. You can restore the paint, you can rebuild the engine, but can you ever escape the curse stamped into its numbers? Number 6, to the untrained eye, the Chevelle SS454 was just a street car with a big engine. But under the skin, it was something far more dangerous. The LS6 block wasn't ordinary cast iron. It carried forged steel crankshafts, 4-bolt main caps, and a Holley 800 CFM carburetor feeding massive oval port heads. Its compression ratio? A staggering 11.25.1, so high that it demanded premium fuel just to survive. This wasn't engineering for comfort, it was engineering for war. Here's the twist. The LS6 was overbuilt. Chevrolet designed it to handle more punishment than the average street driver could ever unleash. Internal testing suggested it could safely rev past 7,000 RPM, well above its advertised limits. Why would Chevy go to such extremes? Some historians believe the LS6 was secretly intended for racing programs that never fully materialized. NASCAR, NHRA, maybe even endurance trials. The engine was built with competition in mind, then slipped into a production car almost as an afterthought. The result? A Chevelle that was more than just fast. It was a factory hot rod, a race engine wearing a license plate. Owners who dared to push it discovered a car that didn't just dominate the street. It whispered of what might have been if GM had unleashed its full racing potential. Number 5. By 1970, the Chevelle SS 454 wasn't just a car, it was a cultural panic. Across the country, newspapers ran headlines about Detroit's death machines. Politicians thundered in hearings that automakers were selling horsepower to children. Safety crusader Ralph Nader, who had already made waves with unsafe at any speed, accused muscle cars of turning suburban driveways into racetracks. And at the center of the firestorm, the Chevelle SS 454. Its numbers terrified the establishment. A mid-sized car with nearly 500 horsepower was unheard of. Critics argued no teenager should have access to that kind of firepower. Parents warned their kids away, insurers made it nearly impossible to afford, and state legislatures even floated bills to ban or restrict high-performance cars altogether. But here's the irony. The more society tried to demonize the Chevelle, the more legendary it became. The killer car label only fueled its mystique. Teenagers who couldn't afford one dreamed harder. Adults who disapproved in public secretly admired it. The Chevelle wasn't just fast, it was forbidden fruit. And nothing makes a machine more desirable than being told you can't have it. Number 4. Few realize how close the Chevelle SS 454 came to being canceled before it even hit the streets. Inside General Motors, accountants were growing nervous. By 1969, the muscle car wars were draining profits. Big engines cost big money, and the return wasn't always guaranteed. To the number crunchers, the SS package looked like dead weight, a flashy distraction from the bread-and-butter Malibus and Impalas that actually paid the bills. At one point, internal memos suggested discontinuing the SS line altogether. Kill it, save the money, move on. But then came the dealers. Chevrolet showrooms depended on halo cars to draw customers through the doors. Even if buyers walked out with a 6-cylinder Chevelle, they came in because the SS was on the lot. Dealers fought back, pushing GM to keep the program alive. The result was rebellion within the ranks. Against the wishes of some executives, the SS 454 was greenlit. It rolled into showrooms in 1970 not because of corporate strategy, but because of dealer defiance. In other words, the Chevelle SS 454 exists because people on the ground refused to let it die. It wasn't born from neat planning. It was born from mutiny. And maybe that's why it feels like a rebel to this day. Number 3 on the street, the Chevelle SS 454 was a wild card. Two cars, both ordered with the same LS6 package, could race each other. And the result was never guaranteed. Why? Factory tolerances. In 1970, precision machining wasn't what it is today. Engines varied. One block might have slightly better port alignment, another tighter bearing clearances. The carburetors, hand-adjusted at the factory, weren't always dialed in the same. The result? Two identical cars could differ by 30-40 horsepower. Street racers knew this. Some Chevelles were unstoppable, pulling away in every gear. Others struggled to live up to their brochure numbers. Word spread fast, and racers developed tricks, blueprinting engines, rejetting carbs, porting heads to wake up the lazy ones. This unpredictability gave the Chevelle a reputation as both weapon and gamble. When you lined up at the light, you didn't just wonder about your opponent. You wondered if your own car was one of the blessed or one of the cursed, and that randomness is part of what makes the SS454 legendary. It wasn't just a car. It was a coin toss with steel, fire, and gasoline. Number 2 by. The time the muscle car era began to fade in the late 1970s, the Chevelle SS454 had already carved its place in folklore. But its reputation didn't end when the factories shut down. It lived on, in songs, in films, and on the streets of new generations. In the 1980s, rappers name-dropped it in lyrics as a symbol of rebellion. In Hollywood, it became the outlaw's car, cast whenever filmmakers needed a machine that screamed defiance. And in the underground drag scene, the SS454 carried a reputation that no amount of technology could erase. Quarter-mile times proved the legend. Stock, the LS6 Chevelle could blast through the quarter in around 13.7 seconds at over 100 miles per hour, numbers that humiliated its competition. Decades later, with electronic fuel injection, computers, and traction control, few modern cars could claim to beat that kind of raw, unfiltered performance without serious modification. And so while the industry moved on, the SS454 stayed alive in memory. It wasn't just a car, it was a benchmark. The car that set the bar so high, even time struggled to catch it. Number 1. The most shocking truth about the Chevelle SS454 is this: it was never meant to last. The LS6 engine option was offered for 1 year only, 1970, just a single model year. Before emissions regulations, fuel crises, and insurance crackdowns forced Chevrolet to pull the plug. The Chevelle SS454 wasn't a dynasty. It was a flash of lightning. And yet, that's exactly what makes it immortal. Because legends aren't built on long reigns. They're built on impact. The SS454 hit so hard, so suddenly, that its echo still rattles the walls of car culture half a century later. It didn't just represent power. It represented freedom, rebellion, a refusal to bow to rules, to politicians, to fear. Every Chevelle that survives today is a rolling time capsule. A reminder of the year when Detroit built a car so powerful, so outrageous, that it had to be stopped almost immediately. The Chevelle SS454 wasn't canceled because it failed. It was canceled because it succeeded too well. So what do we make of it all? The 1970 Chevelle SS454 was more than steel, chrome, and horsepower. It was a conspiracy against corporate rules, a weapon too wild for police to tame, a courtroom controversy, a cultural panic, and in the end, a one-year wonder that became eternal. It roared into history like a rebel with no future, only to become the most famous outlaw of them all. Every crooked stripe, every cursed VN, every whispered dino sheet is part of its legend. It was never just a car. It was rebellion on 4 wheels. The Chevelle SS454 lives on, not because it survived, but because it was never meant to. And that is why it remains the most dangerous, most desired, most unforgettable muscle car America ever built.